First of all, it's cold outside, right? So I'm really glad you all came, because I was given a very clear warning that if the temperature got below a certain level, there was a chance that people wouldn't come. So I'm very glad. Now, I personally just last night got off a plane from New York City, and having now spent more than 20 years living in Israel, I don't understand how people live in New York City. I'm sorry to be distracting from our main topic, but it is very important to me. You go outside, and you're in a freezer, and then you're in, and now when I go to a supermarket and buy ground beef, there's fresh and there's frozen, and the fresh is better than the frozen. And I wonder what happens to a human being over the course of many years when you go in and out of a freezer. It can't be good for you, right? So I was very, very glad to come to Tucson, where the weather seems a lot more like Jerusalem, and the food seems a lot better too. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is a very difficult and crucial question, and really kind of the future of the diaspora Jews, and especially those in America, turns on this question, and that is this. Are we doing Zionism wrong? Have we completely misidentified and misunderstood the fundamental teachings of what Zionism once was? And this is not purely an academic question at all. We are now at a time, I think it's fair to say that we are at a time of crisis for American Jewry. And it's a crisis on many levels, right? You have a situation where, seemingly out of the blue, synagogues are being attacked. Jews in Brooklyn are being attacked by anti-Semites. There seem to be anti-Semites coming out of the woodwork on the left and on the right. It's not clear why, it's not clear what, and at the same time, there's tremendous amount of energy among Jews being poured into political issues that are way outside the realm of Jewish institutional communal life. I personally have been very troubled by what I perceive as a lack of a peoplehood instinct that once was very powerful among Jews everywhere. And when I was a child, I grew up in the Northeast, in New Jersey and Boston. Any Bostonians here, by any chance? All right, good. So I grew up in I went to high school in Boston in the 1980s. I was very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement. That was a movement of Jews pulling together, taking action for other Jews on the other side of the world who were suffering tremendous oppression. And I don't see that impulse today among the major institutions of American Jews. I don't see, and anti-Semitism is one example. I was giving a talk in Virginia Beach at the Federation there, and when I was there, a hurricane, I think it was Irma. I don't know hurricanes personally on a first-name basis, but I do have to say that when I told the Israelis I was going to Miami, 2 weeks ago I was in Miami, when I told the people in Israel, they said, Miami, hurricanes, be really careful. And I kept thinking, this is just how people around the world see Israel. They see it through the lens of the things they see on TV. And now here are Israelis telling you not to go to Miami because I could get hit by a hurricane. So I'm in Virginia Beach, and there's a hurricane that hits Florida. And this may come as a surprise, but not all Jewish communities are vastly wealthy. And there are a lot of Jewish communities in South Florida. And this was just when the hurricane hit, and you're in that horrible first day or two when all you know is Category 5. And the funny thing about hurricanes is that there is no Category 6. Okay, so if it's a Category 5, it's very destructive. We don't know anything about what's going on there. And I said to them, why don't you do an emergency fundraiser for Jewish communities in South Florida? And they looked at me very strangely, and they said, and I will never forget these words, "That's a good idea." And when professional Jewish establishment types say that's a good idea, that's a code word for let's move on to the next subject. Jews are, oh, I thought that was telling me my time was up. Ultra-Orthodox Jews are routinely, frequently now being attacked by anti-Semites in New York City. And I do not see the national Jewish establishment organizing and galvanizing. And that's just in the US. What about Jews abroad? Where are the major US delegations to France? Okay, in Great Britain, according to one poll, 1/3 of British Jews were prepared to consider leaving Britain if Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party were to win that election. That is a very serious level of anti-Semitism. But I don't see the mobilization of established Jewry to help them. What I see is a lot of leaning back on the two kind of educational agenda items of established Jewry, which is Israel education and Holocaust education, which I'm going to circle back to in a minute. And if you ask American Jews, especially the big establishment American Jews, to tell you what Zionism is, which is going to be the topic tonight, most of them will either not have an answer at all or will say, Zionism, well, we support Israel, we give to AIPAC, we send. I was at the GA, and the GA, it's the federations have a conference, and sometimes it's in Israel, and I was there, and there was one rabbi there. The entire conference, all the big federations were represented, there was one rabbi there. And he said, look around, how many rabbis do you see? Now go to the AIPAC conference, and how many rabbis do you see there? Support for Israel, political support for Israel in Washington, has become the expression of Zionism, except that it's not. In this time of crisis, before I get into what Zionism, in my opinion, really is, I have to observe that the national Jewish establishment in the United States of America, when it comes to peoplehood issues, is asleep. They may be making noise about politics, they may be making noise about other things, but on the question of Jews supporting other Jews in danger and in need, they're asleep. They're sleeping. They're snoring. The sleepy Jewish establishment. It's very upsetting. Not only do they not understand what Zionism is, but if you look at the original writings of Zionist writers and thinkers from 100 years ago, the people who inspired the movement that caused Jews to get up and move to the land of Israel and build and build and build, and if you read the writings that they wrote, these writings were not about political support for Israel. They were not about taking pride in Israel. They were about taking pride in being a Jew. What they had was a critique of Jewish life in the diaspora that is every bit as true today as it was then, and that everybody, I believe, should read and take a look at in order to understand what really is going wrong with life in the diaspora. Because all of these weird problems happening at the same time, they're all connected to a single crisis, and it is a crisis of the Spirit. And it's the same crisis of the Spirit that they were responding to a century ago. Now, I just lost the mic. Hello? There's a little red light here. What does that mean? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, there we go. Now, if you look at these writings, what did you see? You saw a big, there's a lot of disagreement among, Jews, right? There's a lot of disagreement among the original Zionist thinkers. Okay, some of them said we need Jewish athletes, what Max Nordau called muscular Judaism. There were others that say, no, we need Jews who can work the land, right, A.D. Gordon. There was Eliezer ben Yehuda's dream of Jews who can reinvent and reinvigorate the ancient Hebrew language and turn it into a language that you can order a train ticket in, which really happened. In fact, I'm going back to Jerusalem, and we're going to have direct high-speed trains to Tel Aviv next week. Next week. I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And then, of course, you had, no, we need Jews who are soldiers. And every single one of these dreams, and for Herzl, who founded the Zionist movement, for him, it was even more that we needed a political center and an economic center, and we'd have Jewish corporations and businesses, and people would be drawn there, not out of ideology, but out of value added and business opportunity, which is something that really came true. And what all of these had in common was the idea that there was something wrong with what being a Jew was after thousands of years in the diaspora. It had hurt us. It had made us uniquely vulnerable to the craziness of history. This is well before the Holocaust, of course. This is at a time, but though there were persecutions, there were pogroms, there were many, many places where Jews felt safe and many other places where they were routinely devastated. And it's not in quantity, but not in scale, but in feeling. It's not so different from that feeling a lot of Jews around the world are starting to feel today. They said we need a new Jew. One who is proud, one who is capable of determining his own fate, his or her own fate, and the fate of the community and the people through a sovereign state. I didn't mention Echad Ha'am and his spiritual center, but it was the same idea. That if we are in control of our own destiny, then the miraculous things that Jews can do will be unleashed on the world in a much deeper level, in a much more comprehensive form of life. And what's interesting to point out is this was, of course, not about Israel, because there was no Israel. I mean, to say, I am a Zionist because I support Israel is like saying, I am a happy person because my Instagram feed says so. Okay, in the best case, it's a shallow representation, and in the worst case, it's a dangerous illusion. Because how much you put money into political support for another country across the pond, that doesn't necessarily resonate at all with the call for change that Zionism was really meant to bring about. And that focused on three things. First of all, it was about pride. Not pride in Israel, but pride in being a Jew. Okay? Now in America, pride is a very difficult thing. Public pride. Public displays of Jewish pride is a touchy subject. When I spent 4 years, sorry I didn't mention this, I didn't tell you a lot about who I am, right? I apologize for that. So give me 30 seconds about my biography. I was born in the United States in New Jersey to Israeli parents. Okay, at a time when there weren't a lot of Israelis on earth, much less in the United States. And I mean, it was a period when if you heard Hebrew somewhere, this is early 90s, I was born in 69, grew up in early 70s as a child, a time when if you heard Hebrew spoken somewhere else, you'd run up to the person, you'd say, what are you doing here? And I grew up with a very acute sense that the cultural values that I was being raised on were a little bit different from those of American Jews. I was a little bit of an oddball. And I never really understood how powerfully different I was until I first visited Israel at the age of 11 and found a whole country of people a lot more like me than the people I was growing up with. I spent almost 20 years there, and then I came back to Washington for 4 years during the second Obama administration. I like to tell people that when Trump was elected, that's why I went back, because I left America, but it wasn't true. I was already, the ticket was booked before the election was completed. But I saw a lot in Washington. I was working for a pro-Israel advocacy organization. I had a chance, when my book came out, to do a tour of the United States, of Jewish communities especially. I spoke to Jews who were Orthodox, I spoke to Reform, I spoke to other Jews, I spoke in congregations. I had something like 35 talks all across America, and really got a chance to hear what being pro-Israel meant. And it was a very strange thing for me, because what I found was that, well, I'll tell you a story. I was in Beverly Hills at a gala dinner raising money for Israel. And there was this joke at the table I was sitting at where they were talking about cab drivers, they were talking about bad experiences visiting Israel, and the woman said, the woman who had been fighting for Israel for half a century, shouts out, "I love Israel, but I hate Israelis." And everybody around the table laughed, and I'm thinking to myself, wait, this is America. I'm Israel. My parents are Israel. I mean, should I not be offended? What is going on here? And then I said, forget the offense. What does it mean to love Israel but not its people? What is Israel without Israelis? It isn't anything. But there's a problem in American Jewry with the concept of pride, and I want to touch on this point, because when American Jews came, look, everywhere Jews went, they developed some kind of a strategy for survival. Sometimes it was more successful, and sometimes it was less. But they had a strategy. It was almost intuitive, but it emerged in every country in its own way. And in the United States, to be blunt and frank, that strategy involved building a certain America, call it secular America, building the secular space where somebody who was not a Christian felt very comfortable speaking their mind, being part of the conversation, and Jews became very deeply involved, let us say even dominant, in secular fields such as journalism, such as Hollywood, such as the legal defense of secular rights. They're very involved in the civil rights movement. And all of that, all of these secular liberal values just happen to coincide with those values most likely to ensure Jewish survival in America. It wasn't a coincidence. And it was very powerful. And the thing that they had to sacrifice for that, however, was pride. And so, while I was in Washington, Vice President Joe Biden gave a speech in honor of National Jewish Heritage Month, the existence of which is unknown to a great many Jews. Okay, I personally cannot tell you what month of the year is National Jewish Heritage Month. I don't know how many people here can. And he gave a speech that was exactly the kind of speech that makes Jews uncomfortable. Jews are, this is not verbatim, Jews have just, your impact on America has been just way beyond your proportions. I mean, you dominate in all of these areas, and in the media, and in Hollywood, and in this, and it's just incredible what the achievements of the Jews are. And all the Jews heard that speech and said, oh, we don't talk that way in public. And that bothered me because Jews may be the only tribe in America at a time of increasing tribalism that doesn't handle pride very well. I was in Washington when the African American Museum opened up, when the African American community built a museum on the Mall in Washington. The thesis, the narrative of that museum is, look what we endured and look what we've achieved. When Jews built a museum on the Mall in Washington, it was entirely about the Holocaust and almost entirely stripped of the word we. If you go to that museum in Washington, you will be treated to a long, vivid account of the Holocaust as seen from the perspective of an alien from outer space. There were these people in Germany, and they were very intolerant, and their intolerance led to genocide, and millions of people were murdered, and genocide is the outcome of intolerance. Now let's look at other genocides around the world. It was the perfect universalization of the Jewish experience. But the word we isn't there. And that troubled me very deeply, because without pride, it's very hard. I mean, I know the reasoning, I get it. Jews have been trained for thousands of years to keep their heads just down a little bit below the radar in the hopes that people don't notice them. But in America, and especially America in the second decade of the 21st century, the absence of pride is seen as a form of self-doubt and weakness. It's a dangerous thing. In fact, if you ask me, what is the core of diaspora Jewish pride? I'm not talking about the Orthodox community because they define themselves very differently, but mainstream diaspora Jewish pride. Well, let's look at what they educate their kids. Two things. Israel, which is the achievements of Jews who rejected the diaspora, and the Holocaust, which is the achievement of people trying to kill Jews. What is the implicit message? It's not, we can be strong and proud and successful in the diaspora. It's get out or die. That's the implicit message, and it's very troubling. Original Zionist teaching was that every Jew has the right and the obligation to stand up and say, I'm proud of being a Jew. And that involves a lot of self-education, because it's kind of embarrassing to be proud of something you know nothing about. It involves a lot of guts sometimes. But above all, it involves an affirmation of peoplehood. Because if you're proud of who you are, you'll have the energy and the power to go out and help others from your tribe, if you're willing to use that concept at all. The Zionist thinkers taught a second thing, which is about action. It's about doing. Okay, doing means it's a habit. It's a personal habit and it's a communal habit. It means all of these committees and all of these conversations, and even this conversation right here, is nothing compared to getting up and taking action for your people. That Virginia Beach comment, that's a good idea, has been met with many, many, many other examples that I see on a daily basis of Jewish communal inaction. Where is the action for the Jewish people? Forget about Israel. And the third thing is that Zionism is about you, and about you, and about you. It's about every individual saying, I'm not going to wait until a convenient moment. This is one of the things that really bugged me. I was, back to the question of how can you love Israel and not love the people. I was struck by the absolute disinterest in Israeliness and in Israeli life. What is it like to be Israeli is not a question that interests a great portion of pro-Israel Jews. How do you know? Because if they really cared, they would first of all study Hebrew. Cosmopolitan Jews know languages, right? Learning languages shouldn't be such a big deal. That's not what I get. I want to study Hebrew. I want my kids to learn Hebrew, but there's never a convenient time. Or, we're Americans, we don't learn languages. Really, we don't learn languages, what are you talking about? But how do you fall in love with a country and don't care about learning its language, and don't care about the culture, and don't care about the experience of what it's like to be Israeli? It's not just about running to bomb shelters. Newsflash. In fact, that's a very tiny part of it. It's about living a certain kind of life with a certain kind of values. Now, Israel is a country built that grew out of this Zionist movement, and where these values of pride, of action, and of the individual's responsibility to constantly rethink what they're doing and constantly be willing to learn and move and fix and help. That's kind of what distinguishes Israeli culture and Israeliness from almost any other culture on earth. It's an amazing thing. But if you don't do that, if you wake up every morning and just keep going on with everything, that's not Zionism. And if you once a year write a check to an organization that claims to be helping Israel, even though a very large portion of that money actually remains in the United States, which is the case with a lot of these organizations, that's not Zionism. That's checking a box that allows you to have to feel good about staying exactly where you've been. It's about personal responsibility and personal change. Because if everybody does it, in fact, if a quarter of the people do it, in fact, if 10% of American Jews change what they're doing and constantly look to see what should I be doing, what can I be doing to change myself and to change my community and to help Jews everywhere, that's what Zionism looks like. Just imagine with me for a minute how different everything would look in American Jewry, in the response to BDS, in the response to anti-Semitism, in crossing political lines, because today political lines are much more powerful determinants of identity than the fact of being Jewish. Crossing denominational lines, getting together to take action on behalf of Jews in need, or on behalf of education and study. It would feel very different. It would look very different than it does today. I want to end with my personal choice that I made 3 years ago. When I came back from Washington, I just want to tell you, first of all, I love texts. Okay, I've spent my whole career reading and writing and editing and translating and helping other writers and teaching writing. I like text so much that when people call me on the phone, I'm like, why don't you text me? I prefer that because it just so, texts are things that you control and manipulate, and it gives you a sense of, at least me. So I wrote a piece about Israeli culture, Israeliness, and the future of American Jewry. And before it even came out, I showed it to a friend of mine, Adam Bellos, that man there. Raise your hand, Adam. Okay? And Adam said to me, and I'll leave the profanity out of what he said, just because we're being recorded, right? So I don't want it to be on the record. He said, you have been blowing me off for 6 months since you came back to Israel, and you write this piece, and I've been telling you to come and see what I'm doing, and this is what I'm doing, and you're going to come and see what I'm doing. So I went to Tel Aviv. I live in Jerusalem. I went to Tel Aviv, and I met the team at the Israel Innovation Fund. And I was really blown away, because he really was putting into action something that I had been comfortably talking about through with the protective cover of texts. But he was doing it. And then he said to me, you're going to come and work for me. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, because it's what you want. And it's because it's what I want. And now I get what I want. And he was right. What is the Israel Innovation Fund? And those of you who were fortunate enough or wise enough to attend the wine tasting that we had just beforehand may have gotten a chance to learn a little bit about what we do. But what the Israel Innovation Fund is a nonprofit organization registered in the US as a 501c3 that is about spreading the word of Israeli culture in the world. Now, many of you may not know this, but today, and it wasn't the case 30 years ago when I first moved to Israel, today Israeli culture is a global power. Okay, Israeli culture today is where Israeli high-tech was before anybody wrote about Startup Nation. If you're in the field, you know about Israel, whether it's wine and food, whether it's TV and film, whether it's design and architecture, whether it's the culinary arts, music, I mean, you name it. There isn't a cultural field that doesn't have a lot. I was just in Paris purely by chance with my kids, because when you live in Israel, you get to go to Europe, and it's just like it's just like flying to San Francisco. It's nothing, right? So I went to Rome, and everyone's like, oh, wow. No, but it's really not a big deal. And I took my kids to Paris, and the Paris Jazz Festival was happening. It's a month-long festival outdoors in some park. I don't remember the name. And they dedicate 3 full days to Israeli jazz. jazz. The field of jazz music has discovered Israeli jazz as a very powerful thing. You walk through the streets of New York City, through the East Village, and look at the jazz flyers, and you'll see a lot of Israeli names. So the Israel Innovation Fund is aimed at telling this story. Now, I have to say, and we do it through just a whole bunch of wine, art, film, video. Wine on the Vine is our flagship project. You've heard about planting trees in Israel, right? We've been doing it for a century. I don't know if I can say with a full heart that Israel really needs more trees. And if we're on the subject, I will mention that the leading environmental group in Israel has recently come out against trees because they feel that transforming ecosystems is not nearly as important as preserving ecosystems, and that, that Israel has a natural ecosystem. But we don't have to get into it. Let's put it this way. For many, many, many decades, planting trees is an extremely important, extremely helpful way for Jews and non-Jews around the world to take part in the Zionist enterprise. Wine on the Vine plants grapevines at leading Israeli wineries. It's a lot of fun. Grapevines are cool. Kids love grapevines. Kids love wine. Grapevines tell a story about the Jewish ancient connection to the land, the Zionist connection to the land, and the future of Israeli culture. There are more than 330 wineries in Israel. We do work with street artists, beautifying municipal areas in Jerusalem, underserved municipal areas. We do parties. It's really an amazing thing. But the most important thing for you to know is that the Israel Innovation Fund began in Tucson, Arizona. Okay? Adam, can you say a few words about how the Israel Innovation Fund began in Tucson, Arizona?
I would just have to say very simply,
but
I did not receive this.
Just louder, a little louder.
Can you all hear me?
Now, yes.
So I did not receive the support that I needed from the Hillel at the University of Arizona, but I did receive the support from the two people sitting in the front row right there, Dr. Ed Wright and Dr. David Graysworth, who took the time to cultivate me and teach me how to think and to embrace my eccentricity. And who saw, I guess, my vision of what I wanted for the next generation, and they taught me to not only conquer my own academic fear, but also to believe in myself enough to go forward with my dreams. And because of that, I had the confidence to start the Israel Innovation Fund, and I'm also really lucky because my brother in arms, who just disappeared, John Winchester, was always with me as well. Without Dr. Wright and Dr. Graysworth, I wouldn't be who I am, and I owe them everything.
The Israel Innovation Fund is about sharing experiences more than messaging or fighting. Okay, it's about tasting some amazing wine and encountering some amazing Israeli vibes and we're bringing it around the world. Through our Jaffa Nights program, we bring full immersive Israeli events to local communities around the United States. And this is my personal way of taking action, of being a Zionist in the old-fashioned way. Because the future of Zionism is not, and listen, it's not people making Aliyah. And I say this as somebody who at the age of 19, on a gap year program in Israel, when there was a Zionist Congress gathering in Jerusalem, I stood outside protesting the Zionist Congress with a banner that said, Zionism equals Aliyah. Because we felt that the Zionist movement in the world didn't care enough about the thing that really counted, which was more Jewish bodies in Israel. Today, that's not the thing that really counts. And I don't want anybody in this room or outside of it to come away thinking that I'm anti-Aliyah. Okay? I believe that my life in Israel is much, much richer because I'm there. First of all, the food's better. Second of all, the weather's better. And once you have the food and the weather, you can get used to everything else. But But if we focus too much on Israel, paradoxically, we're missing the core messages of Zionism, because Zionism was about being a different kind of Jew in your world. And every individual should come up with their own way and figure out their own path to doing it. And if we all did, believe it or not, the issues that frighten us would frighten us much less. We would have the armor and the arms we need to fight off any enemy. And so that's what I want to leave you with, which is sort of a wish and a hope that we can rediscover these teachings and apply it to the current crises we face. Because if we don't, well, it's not going to look very pretty. But if we do, we can have really an amazing, amazing future ahead of us. Thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.